Welcome to episode 9 of The Crisis, a day-by-day account of Britain's 1931 crisis brought to you 90 years on. Saturday, the 22nd of August, had seen MacDonald desperately strive for a compromise between his own cabinet and the opposition, and he had finally secured approval from both to put a tentative program of £76 million worth of cuts to New York to see if this would be sufficient to secure a government loan. The answer was not due until the evening, UK time, on Sunday. Two important figures arrived in London late on Saturday evening and early on Sunday morning. First, the Conservative leader Stanley Baldwin, recalled from his holiday in the south of France, and then King George V, returning from Balmoral in Scotland. Upon arriving in London, the King summoned MacDonald to Buckingham Palace, where he arrived at 10:30 a.m. Sunday, the 23rd of August. MacDonald brought the monarch up to speed on the whole situation and painted a gloomy picture. The Prime Minister believed that Henderson, Graham, and others would reject the economies, even if New York offered a loan, and therefore the Labour government would have to resign. MacDonald made it clear he intended to resign also, and he advised George V to then call for Baldwin and the acting Liberal leader Samuel. The King replied, according to MacDonald's diary, that he, quote, would advise them, Baldwin and Samuel, strongly to support me. He also said that he believed I was the only person who could carry the country through. I said that did I share his belief, I should not contemplate what I do, but that I did not share it. The King was clearly of the opinion that MacDonald must stay on, but for the time being, given the hostility of his own party and the rejection of the national government idea by the cabinet the previous day, MacDonald clearly intended to go. Next, the King called for Baldwin. As leader of the opposition, he was effectively Prime Minister in waiting, but Baldwin could not be found. Therefore, George V saw the Liberal Sir Herbert Samuel at noon. Samuel recommended to the King an all-party national government, led by MacDonald, as the Labour leader would be, quote, more likely to carry the working classes than a minority Tory administration. If painful and difficult times were coming, better to spread the burden between all three parties and thereby attract the most popular support. It was not until 3 p.m. that Baldwin could be tracked down at a private club and summoned to the palace. The first question the King asked him was likely a surprise. The monarch asked the Conservative leader whether he would be willing to serve under MacDonald in a national government. Baldwin, who it might be remembered was an anti-coalitionist in the early 1920s, must have believed he was about to become Prime Minister for a third time. He therefore replied evasively that he was, quote, prepared to do anything to save the country, but that should MacDonald resign, he himself would be willing to form a government. Baldwin, for the time being, held out on the possibility of the Conservatives returning to office, even if Chamberlain later told him it would be preferable to bring some of the Labour ministers with them. Meanwhile, the Labour cabinet reconvened, with one absentee, Lord Parmoor, at 7 p.m. to hear the answer from New York. The reply did not in fact arrive until after 9 p.m. MacDonald read the cable to the ministers. The answer was a positive one. The president of the Federal Reserve Bank, George L. Harrison, believed that $100 to $150 million of private credit could be raised in New York, and a similar amount from Paris on the basis of the cabinet proposals for balancing the budget. The final paragraph of the cable read, quote, are we right in assuming that the program under consideration will have the sincere approval and support of the Bank of England and the city generally, and thus go a long way towards restoring internal confidence in Great Britain? Of course, our ability to do anything depends on the response of public opinion, particularly in Great Britain, to the government's announcement of the program. At this, there was apparently pandemonium and outrage in the cabinet from the rebels who condemned this banker's dictation. Historian Philip Williamson believes this outcry was premeditated by the rebel ministers, led by Henderson, in order to effectively bring the government down, even though the tone of the message was decidedly mild. MacDonald responded with a passionate appeal to his colleagues to accept the proposals. The £76 million was acceptable to the opposition and to the bankers. An escape route had been found. He asked that the cabinet agree to the program, including as it did the 10% cut in the dole, and played his final card, saying that if any minister felt it necessary to resign rather than accept such a measure, the whole government must resign also. He hoped by this to pressure his colleagues into accepting and thus avoid the fall of the government. Each cabinet member was then asked to express their view on the proposals and the 10% cut. In the end, the cabinet split 11-9 in favor. Such a large split meant that despite the majority being in favor, the government's life was at an end. and it was unanimously agreed to tender the cabinet's resignation. The cabinet then agreed that MacDonald should see the king immediately, inform him of their decision, and advise the monarch to hold a conference of the three-party leaders for the following morning. At 10:15 p.m., MacDonald arrived at Buckingham Palace, quote, scared and unbalanced, and intending to leave office. The king was soothing, telling him not to rush into hasty decisions, insisting that he was, quote, the only man to lead the country through the crisis, and informing MacDonald of the fact that Samuel and Baldwin would support him in a national government. MacDonald then returned to Downing Street, telling his cabinet colleagues that he had informed the king that the Labour government could not continue and that the king had accepted the idea of the three-leader conference the following morning. The cabinet agreed that Baldwin and Samuel, who had just arrived at Downing Street, should be informed of the reply from New York and also set their next meeting, surely their last, for 12 noon on Monday, the 24th of August, so they could hear the results of the three-leader palace conference. Henderson at this point believed that a national government was the most likely outcome, and MacDonald had certainly been affected by the news the king had given him that the other leaders would serve under him. However, when MacDonald saw Baldwin, Samuel, and Chamberlain late on the 23rd of August, after the cabinet had dispersed, he was despondent and gave all present the impression that he intended to resign. Chamberlain worked hard to persuade MacDonald to head a coalition. He wrote that MacDonald resisted, saying, quote, for himself, he would help us to get these proposals through, though it means his death warrant. But it would be of no use for him to join a government. He would be a ridiculous figure, unable to command support, and would bring odium on us as well as himself. I then intervened. Had he considered that though not commanding many votes in the House, he might command much support in the country? And would not a government including members of all parties hold a much stronger position than a two-party combination? Ramsay MacDonald said that his mind was not fully made up, but that was his present mood. I then suggested that many people would not understand why, if he supported the new government, he had refused to enter it. He replied that that was a worrying point, but people would say he had stuck to office for the sake of the salary. To which I replied, if several of his colleagues accompanied him, the odium would, at least, be spread. Finally, I asked him if he had considered the effect on foreign opinion, which was all important. This argument took him in a weak place. He said, without egotism, he thought his name did carry weight in America. Samuel strongly supported Chamberlain, while Baldwin said nothing. Chamberlain's case was a sound one. A three-party government would be more popular, more likely to succeed, and MacDonald was internationally respected. However, as we have seen, Chamberlain had other motives, namely breaking the Labour Party. Baldwin clearly was at best lukewarm about the whole idea, while Samuel was evidently excited by the prospect of a return of the Liberals to power. MacDonald, while his mind was, as he said, not made up, was not yet persuaded, and realized that to join a coalition in the face of Labour opposition would ruin his reputation in the party he had dedicated his life to. Baldwin relayed the following to a friend. Quote, it was quite clear that he, MacDonald, intended to resign, and that he had no intention of joining a coalition, even though the king had urged him to head one. Neville, however, pressed on him the support in the country that he would bring to such an administration and the effect it would have on restoring confidence. His arguments seemed to have no effect. To everyone else at the meeting, it seemed quite certain that MacDonald intended to resign, and S.B., Baldwin, returned from it convinced that he would have to form a government. Nor did he think it a bad thing, since he had little love for coalitions. MacDonald, surely utterly exhausted by this point, had not yet made up his mind, but he was probably still in favor of the option he had discussed with Jimmy Thomas the night before, leaving office but becoming independents who would support their successors in trying to save the pound. He rang his son in Lossiemouth past midnight to tell him he would be resigning the next day and would come up and join him in Scotland the day after. He wrote in his diary, quote, am preparing statement if I resign to give to the press at once. I commit political suicide to save the crisis. If there is no other way, I shall do it cheerfully as an ancient Jap. How few people understand the unattractiveness of this place and this office to me. The form of the next government, in effect, rested on the shoulders of one man, and he was clearly tortured by the decision confronting him. Save his country or his party, sacrifice himself or preserve his reputation. In a state of confusion, Ramsay MacDonald decided to sleep on it. Thanks so much for watching episode 9 of The Crisis. If you enjoyed it, then consider dropping a like, because it really helps us out, and if you're not already, consider subscribing to never miss another episode. As well as that, as always, we'd like to thank our patrons, including our executive producers, Eustace Abel, Jeremy Marcoux, Tom McCool, and Tony Chirin for helping to support the show. Thanks so much, and see you in the next episode.